Okay, rhetorical theory students, it's now time to talk about a really important development in the history of rhetoric and rhetorical theory, and that's Plato's contribution to rhetoric. Basically, we're talking about two dialogues written by Plato, and as I mentioned in the earlier podcast about Socrates, Plato uses Socrates as his main character in most of his dialogues. And in two of his rather famous dialogues, Gorgias and Phaedrus, the main topic is rhetoric, what we're studying in this class. So here you see the first truly philosophical critique of rhetoric, what it is, its assumptions, its outcomes. So we're going to get a little bit deeper into that than we have with some of the other topics before. Before we do that, let's talk a little bit about who Plato was. You already heard a little bit about him before. I explained that we really wouldn't know that much about Socrates if it weren't for Plato, who was one of his proteges. And Plato lived a good long life, 81 years. And you can see that he spanned 2 centuries BC. Of course, the dates are in reverse, so the numbers are getting smaller because you're getting closer to the birth of Christ. Okay, he was from a wealthy and influential family, which is one of the reasons why he probably had the time and luxury of doing what he wanted. And one of the things he liked to do was to hang around with Socrates on the streets of Athens and have philosophical discussions. Be kind of like in current days, if somebody was from a rich family, their children might be expected to be hanging out and doing what they want. And this is what the young men in Athens, some of them anyway, like to do, was hang around with Socrates, drink, have philosophical discussions, and maybe even worse things that I won't go into. When Socrates died, Plato, taking advantage of the wealth of his family, traveled throughout the region, Egypt, Italy, and studied with students of Pythagoras. Now, you may know the name Pythagoras because Pythagoras was the founder of geometry and the Pythagorean theorem, which you all probably studied in high school and maybe in college. And of course, this was one of the great contributions of the ancient Greeks, as they created all the subject matters that we have to study today in colleges and universities, including mathematics, geometry, philosophy, history, and many other subjects as well. The first courses of higher education were established in ancient Greece. Eventually, after some traveling and showing some brilliance, he returned to Athens and established his own school, which was called the Academy, and we still use the word academy today to refer generically to all institutions of learning. So the word academic, which I'm sure you've heard, derives from the name of Plato's school Academy, and of course Plato was the founder of the first school of higher education or advanced studies in Western civilization, and that tradition continues. And in fact, the school of the Academy existed for many, many, many centuries later, well after Christ, and was finally, I think, abolished by Constantine because it was considered to be primarily a pagan academy rather than a Christian one. And when Constantine declared Christianity the official religion of Europe, then pagans studies went away in favor of Christian studies. All right, so let's move on now and talk about what Plato said about rhetoric. 3 works are very important. The first, the Apology, I mentioned that when I was talking about Socrates. We're not going to really talk any more about that except to say that, again, that was Socrates' speech of defense at his trial. And it's relevant to the study of rhetoric because it's a speech, and after all, rhetoric is the art that developed speeches. But there are really 2 standout dialogues, one kind of an early dialogue and the one more of a middle dialogue by Plato, one called the Gorgias and the other called the Phaedrus. They're both named for characters in the dialogue. Gorgias, as you might imagine, is primarily a conversation with Gorgias about the nature of rhetoric. And Phaedrus is a conversation with a young man named Phaedrus, not only about the nature of rhetoric, but also about the nature of love. So in this presentation, I'm just going to talk about Gorgias, and I'm going to deal with the issues raised in the Phaedrus separately, because there's quite a bit to say about both. Okay, so let's go ahead and proceed. So the Gorgias was written 385 BC, considered one of Plato's early works. Scholars of Plato divide his works into early, middle, and late periods. The idea normally is advanced that if it's an early work, it was heavily influenced by the beliefs of Socrates, and so Plato is putting into Socrates' mouth things that Socrates might have actually believed or said. So if Socrates was critical of rhetoric, Plato would have depicted him as critical of rhetoric in the Gorgias, being an early work. The middle works have some of Socrates' ideas and then some of Plato's ideas that he was incorporating. And by the time you get to the later works, probably the most notable of which is something called Laws. It's one of the biggest and last works that Plato wrote. You're hearing nothing but Plato's viewpoints primarily, and they're being greatly differentiated from Socrates. So as I mentioned, Gorgias is an early work, and has a couple of major ideas. First of all, that dialectic, which is I've mentioned in a previous presentation, is the logical discussion that takes place in order for truth to be discovered or remembered, is the true way to know. And rhetoric is not that method, but a method where somebody simply communicates things that have already been determined or believed by virtue of people holding opinions. We'll go more deeply into what both of these things mean as we watch the critique unfold. It's a very interesting critique. Okay, so the way the dialogue is structured is very interesting, and I do encourage you to read it. There's a copy of it on the website. It's not long. It's entertaining. It reads like a play. The arguments are fun. They're back and forth. Everybody has a little sport with each other as they argue these different issues, and you get to hear how eloquently Socrates can defend his philosophical method and principles. But in the first round, Gorgias and Socrates go around on what rhetoric is. It's a very interesting discussion. They talk about the nature of rhetoric, whether rhetoric is an art, and I'll come back to these as we go into the subsequent slides. Then there's a second round, a younger devotee of Gorgias talks about rhetoric as being a knack, as opposed to rhetoric being a true art or a true ability, whether or not it's a sham or a counterfeit. We'll get into that as well. And finally, the third round, this is where the whole issue of rhetoric gets turned to an issue of ethics and whether rhetoric is moral and what's the nature of power and who holds power in society. It becomes a much more contentious argument, and you can see the Callicles and Socrates are really bitterly divided in their philosophical positions of the world. And when I talk about that third round in a minute, I'll mention how that pre-shadows some other things that you might have already learned about. Okay, so let's talk about the topics that are raised. First of all, what is rhetoric? Remember that the sophists had defined rhetoric as the art of persuasion. And Socrates, in his questioning and his probing of Gorgias, he wants to know, does rhetoric by its very nature tend to mislead? Because if your purpose in rhetoric is to persuade and there's no attention given to truth but just persuasion, isn't the idea that you can persuade about anything. Okay, so what happens to a society when a persuasion is the basis for law and justice, where it's just what people believe or their opinion rather than the truth or any underlying thing? And so this creates a conflict, which runs all through Plato, by the way, between two types of seeming knowledge, one being what's called doxa, or mere opinion, and the other called episteme, or true knowledge. So Plato is basically saying in the Gorgias that what you have is a conflict between people who teach rhetoric, who teach people how to persuade using opinion, and therefore have no basis in knowledge for what they're persuading about, and people who use knowledge or true knowledge as the basis of governing a society. So we don't know whether justice is involved. All right, so Socrates, Plato, same person because Plato wrote it and he puts his ideas in Socrates' mouth. He asks Gorgias, what is the nature of rhetoric? If rhetoric's an art, what is it an art of and what's it about? There's a long period of sentences and questions and probes back and forth about what that means. It's a very interesting discussion because basically he gets to Gorgias to admit that almost everything you can study and learn uses words and has to use words effectively. So he keeps asking him, what's the subject matter of rhetoric? For example, he says, when you go to the doctor talks to you. If the doctor convinces you, for example, that you should be eating a certain way, exercising a certain way, taking certain medication, getting enough sleep, he's persuading you, and he's persuading you based on his medical knowledge. So he's asking Gorgias, is not a doctor a rhetorician? Doesn't he persuade people about how to, in fact, follow a course of good health? And Gorgias acknowledges that. And then he says to him, Socrates says to Gorgias, but you're not a doctor, so you don't teach medicine. So if a doctor uses persuasive words in getting you to follow a course of medical behavior, how can you differentiate rhetoric, which is about effectiveness in words or persuasive words? And what Gorgias basically says is, well, rhetoric is about words in every discipline, in every subject matter, in every profession. No matter where you are or what you do, you use rhetoric, and a rhetorician knows how to use words effectively no matter what the situation. So a rhetorician, according to Gorgias, could even advise a doctor about how to be persuasive. There's a difference between persuading somebody what they need to do to be healthy and what the doctor knows about what is necessary to be healthy. It's kind of like, for example, the distinction between knowing that smoking is bad for you and being persuaded not to smoke, okay, which are two different things. So at least Socrates, Plato gets Gorgias to admit that that's not really a good definition of rhetoric, right? Because everybody uses persuasion in every field, and so those fields are never defined as rhetoric. They're defined as the fields themselves. In other words, there's a contrast between what we know in a field, like medicine, for example, and what we simply opine or express in as opinion, which we want somebody to believe or accept because we're persuasive or have the ability to persuade. Okay, so this is a really interesting, I think, discussion about if you're learning to be effective with language, what kind of an ethical constraint does that put on you? For example, if I as a rhetorician can convince somebody to get an operation, but a doctor can't convince you to get an operation, and I'm more effective, right, then what does that say about medicine? Also, what does it say if you would need somebody who's effective at language but not necessarily effective at medicine to convince you to have a medical procedure? Doesn't that show you an inherent weakness of medicine if it doesn't have effectiveness added to the truth that you're trying to communicate? Okay, so in the continuing discussion between Plato and Gorgias, they finally get to the point that Gorgias thinks that because rhetoric is primarily used in law courts and assemblies where people are talking about governmental issues or issues of judgment before a judge or a jury or a panel, or because they're making decisions and voting, that rhetoric is really about justice, about that when you teach somebody to argue, you're teaching them how to argue for a just cause or a just conclusion. But even this is really a bad or a dissatisfying answer for Socrates, because he says, but rhetoricians don't know what's just. They don't even know the nature of justice. They're not philosophers. They don't study what's right and wrong. They study how to be effective in front of a judge or an assembly. And the public is generally ignorant, and so you can make arguments that are designed for the masses, and they don't really respect the truth. So according to Socrates, or Plato, the rhetorician is not a teacher of law courts and other public gatherings as to what are right or wrong, but merely a creator of beliefs for evidently he could never instruct so large a gathering in so short a time. So rhetoric is kind of a shorthand, a shortcut. When you persuade somebody, you kind of bypass the need to educate them or train them or enlighten them about what you're trying to get them to believe. It's kind of like today where if a professor gets up and says to you, look, I'm not going to tell you why this is true, but this is the book that you should read if you want to pass this class. So nobody usually challenges the professor and says, well, that's not a good book, or why is that book important? You just basically take it on as authority and as credibility, which are obviously dimensions of his persuasiveness, that's the book that you ought to read. Okay, now before we go on, let's just stop and say where we are right now. There's been a conversation between Socrates and Gorgias about the nature of rhetoric. He's asked him a lot about what rhetoric is, and he's also asked him about what rhetoric's subject matter is and what it teaches. And the only thing that Gorgias can basically come up with is that rhetoric is kind of about justice and about persuading people what's just and unjust. But of course, Socrates dismisses this by saying that, you don't really know what's just and unjust. So if you teach somebody to persuade about that, it's the persuasion you're focusing on and not the truth of whether it's just or unjust. Okay, I hope everybody followed that. So then he turns over the discussion to a younger guy, Polus, which means the colt, little horse. And he is going to talk a little bit about how rhetoric is actually being diminished here by Socrates inappropriately, because rhetoric is a great power, okay? The power to persuade. You can have great effectiveness or great success in civic life and in society. You all who are communication students, you know that if you're good at public speaking and you're good at persuasion and you're good at leading meetings and debating and arguing, if you're an effective communicator, that's a great skill to have, and it'll be a key to your success in your life. And so Polus is basically saying that that's the case, that's why rhetoric is a great art, because of its power, its usefulness, and how it'll help you. But even there, Plato or Socrates will not let that lie, because he's basically going to challenge Polus to a very interesting debate or discussion about how rhetoric compares with other things that claim to be arts. Okay, so if I say as a sophist that I teach the art of persuasion, I could be asked or challenged to tell the nature of the art that I teach. What is the art that I teach? Okay. So there's a very long, interesting interchange. I'll just conflate it all for you into a little bit here about what a true art is versus a sham art. Okay. So here's an example. Let's say we'll go back to physicians. And by the way, in Greek, the word for art is techne, which is also basically the word for science. So the Greeks basically thought that an art and a science were the same thing. It was basically anything where you could develop principles and it could be systematized and used in a very effective and predictable way. Okay, so let's say you have a stomach ache. You go to the doctor. The doctor says, here's the problem. Here's what's causing your stomach ache, and this is what you need to do. Gives you a medicine. Okay? Take the medicine. You may not get symptomatic relief. In other words, the stomach ache may not go away, but the underlying cause, the physiological problem that's causing the stomach ache, is being treated by the medicine. This is the doctor's kind of methodological and scientific approach to curing your ill. Okay? And I'm sure you've all been through this. You'll have a sinus infection, you take antibiotics, and it's not until a week after you start taking it that you actually start to feel better. Okay? Now, Plato says, with the same stomach ache, you could go to a friend of yours who mixes as a really good cocktail. And he says, listen, drink this cocktail. You'll feel so good, you won't even care if your stomach hurts. And sure enough, you drink this thing and you get feeling really good, and you don't even worry about your stomach ache. And as a matter of fact, you don't even notice that your stomach's bothering you, because you're having a kind of an inebriating or intoxicating effect from what it is that you're drinking. But the next day, when that wears off, not only do you feel like crap, but your stomach ache is worse because you actually irritated your stomach more. Okay? So basically, Plato is saying that rhetoric is like the latter, where if you hear words and they persuade you, They might sound great and they might have an immediate effect of making you feel like, wow, that's true, or I really believe that. But the next day you're saying, but was that true? Okay. Was there really a basis for believing that? You might have buyer's remorse about being persuaded by something that's done in less than the artistic or systematic way. So I hope you follow that. Okay? Another aspect of the argument that's very interesting here is that because rhetoric is powerful and can be used in a powerful way, it puts an ethical responsibility on the person that uses it. Now, I don't know how many of you have seen the movie The Karate Kid. Great old movie, okay? So in The Karate Kid, there's a very interesting thing. There's a group of karate villains, I'll call them, young guys who are kind of thugs and juvenile delinquents who beat up on the hero, right? And he's also studying karate, but he's studying karate for defense. He's learning it the correct way. His teacher is teaching him that karate is used for self-defense, not for offense. Karate is a way of life. It's a philosophy. It's not just a weapon, okay? So there's a conflict between these two types of use of karate. Well, rhetoric's kind of like that too, okay? So, for example, if Gorgias teaches me to use rhetoric, right, I'm not going to go home and yell at my mother and scream at her and persuade her that she's a horrible person, because that would be a hurtful and horrible thing to do. Same thing, if somebody teaches me karate, I'm not going to go home and beat up my mother. So rhetoric has to be used for the right purposes to be acceptable ethically. But since the rhetorician or the sophist doesn't really bother to teach you whether or not what you're arguing is ethical or whether there's a basis for considering it ethical, you don't have any way of knowing whether it's good rhetoric or bad rhetoric. And this is another criticism. But of course the answer, and Gorgias and Paulus try to provide this, is, listen, just because I teach you this doesn't mean that because you use it incorrectly that it's therefore bad. That's your fault, just like in the Karate Kid. And in fact, that's a pretty good defense of rhetoric. And later on when we talk about Aristotle, that's the defense he offers of rhetoric, because he doesn't believe that rhetoric is a bad thing like Plato does. In fact, develops a whole system to teach it and says that the great thing about rhetoric is it can be used to help the truth win a victory in an argument. Okay. So here's the difference between good arts and bad arts. Okay. So for example, we have arts of health. Okay. If you want to feel better, you take medicine and you exercise. However, if you want to look better, but not necessarily get better, you can wear makeup or get a tan, right? And you can resort to what's called cookery, which is mix potions or drink things which maybe make you feel good, but aren't necessarily making you better. I guess a good example of that would be if you take a painkiller, but you don't treat your underlying cause of your pain, which might be an injury or some other thing in your body. Same thing is true with how we maintain not just our body, but also our spirit or our soul. The real arts of the soul, according to Plato, Socrates, are, first of all, legislation. If we're going to have a good and just society, we have to have meaningful debates based on truth and investigation of the facts. Also in our law courts, we have to have justice where the advocates or the participants in the process tell the truth and understand the nature of justice and what it means to reach a just outcome. But the sham art of the soul, just like there's a sham art of health and medicine, the sham art of the soul is sophistic and rhetoric, meaning that sophistic gives the appearance that you are legislating because you know how to make legislative arguments, but they're not necessarily based on truth. And the appearance of justice because you're making arguments about justice using rhetoric, but not necessarily basing them on the truth. So really what he says about rhetoric is that rhetoric is a sham or a counterfeit art of politics where you pretend that you know what the just is and you argue on the basis of justice without having a foundation in truth. Now we move to the final phase of the Gorgias, which is a debate between Socrates and Callicles. And Callicles comes in now with a much more powerful argument about the nature of rhetoric. And now he links rhetoric not only to persuasion and justice, but to power, that those who rule have the power to rule because what they can say and the power that they have all over. And he argues that there is in society something, a natural justice, or the rule of the intelligent over the baser. By the baser, he means the inferior class. So there are people who are less intelligent, have less money, less influence. He believes by nature that those people were meant to be ruled over by people who are of superior intelligence, power, wealth, and influence. And rhetoric is the tool by which they rule. It could involve lying, oppressing people, keeping the truth from them, having a closed society, having a tyrannical society, a dictatorial society. All these are the negatives that emanate from that. And in doing so, he describes something that actually the term doesn't develop for another almost 2,000 years. He does something that's usually referred to as Machiavellian, which is a name that derives from the Renaissance philosopher, who we'll learn about, by the way, Machiavelli, who basically feels that political science or the administration of justice is the maintenance of power within society. He advises princes and leaders how to maintain power using not only rhetoric but also other tools of influence, including administration of justice, money, power, arms, military, and even propaganda. So this is the third part. Now, in this third part, Socrates advances what I think is an absolutely beautiful argument. His argument is that in a just society, if the stronger people are ruling the weaker people, it is the weaker people who actually benefit the most. In other words, what he argues is that in an unjust society, the people who are persecuted, right, are actually better off than the people who are doing the persecuting. Because the way he argues it is it's better to suffer injustice than do injustice. He's basically saying that if I'm a victim of injustice, I haven't really done anything wrong. But if I think that I'm right, and while I think I'm right, I'm actually practicing injustice by discriminating against or repressing or harming another class of people, I'm actually doing an injustice. So I think I'm right, but I'm actually wrong. That's worse than just simply being wronged. So he has this beautiful ethical theory, which actually gets expanded in the Republic, which is his most famous work, Plato's most famous work, The Republic, in which he's basically saying the victims of injustice are far superior than the perpetrators of injustice. People who are unjust think they're right, but they're not right. And people who are just usually suffer as a consequence of the people who are unjust but think they are just. This is comes to mind somebody like Hitler, who clearly in his warped view of the world was doing something great by trying to exterminate whole races of people and destroy so many people. But the people who are victims of that, they're kind of like the righteous. What did they ever do wrong except stand there and take it, right? So they haven't done anything in particular. So in saying this, Plato is actually, by almost 400 years, he is foreshadowing the teachings of Jesus Christ. He's basically saying that, like Jesus did, that if somebody smacks you on the cheek, you should give them the other cheek. In other words, it's much better to be a victim of injustice than to perpetrate injustice. He's also saying something like, he's not saying love your enemies, but he's basically saying that your enemies don't understand the horrible wrong that they do because their eyes haven't been opened to the truth about what's just and unjust. So this is where the dialogue kind of ends up, where it proclaims this very beautiful theory of justice, where Socrates is giving you insight into Plato's much more expansive view of the nature of justice, which the sophists clearly don't understand because they're using justice to mean the more powerful people getting their way or using rhetoric as a way to advance your own personal power. Okay, so what were the major claims in the Gorgias? First of all, that sophistic rhetoric is misleading. It's designed to convince the audience they're dealing with truth when they're really just perpetuating opinion. In other words, the sham art of politics substituted for the true art of politics. the rejection of a transient notion of truth. In other words, that if you argue something in front of a jury or in front of a court, that you're basically saying that what I'm saying is true for just now or just this moment, but doesn't extend beyond here, whereas truth is actually more permanent and enduring. And rhetoric seeks persuasion while philosophy seeks truth. So a persuader wouldn't have any way of really knowing what the truth is or how to persuade you of it, whereas a philosopher seeks truth and may or may not want to persuade you of it. So when we continue in part 2 of this lecture about Plato on rhetoric, we'll talk about the other dialogue mentioned, the Phaedrus. But that's all I have to say about the Gorgias. If you have any questions, please post them on the blog and we'll have a discussion about the Gorgias, which is a really important work, early work about rhetorical theory. Thanks for listening.